So good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name's Meyer. I am with SAS. SAS is the worldwide analytics leader, and Joe Zilka is here with me as well. I'm going to let Joe introduce himself a little bit later when he starts a product demo for you. I'll share a little bit of my background, but we're here today to talk a little bit about this idea of transforming government by using data and analytics. Obviously, we work for an analytics company. But to give you a little bit of my background, prior to coming to SAS, I worked for the state of North Carolina for about 18 years. So I've been a government practitioner most of my career. And my last job before I came to SAS was the director of the Government Data Analytics Center in North Carolina, which was a statewide enterprise program focused on helping our state better access and use data to sort of change the ways we did our business decision making in North Carolina. And Joe's going to show you a solution that is similar to some of the ones we are using in the state of North Carolina a little bit later as we talk about data, how we gather it from different locations, and how we use it. So why is data and all this idea of big data and analytics, why is this suddenly at the forefront? For those of you who have worked in government, we have been in the business of big data for our entire careers. Big data is nothing new to government. We collect data on everything: who lives in our state, who works in our state, what services they get, who we make payments to, who's driving cars, where they live, how many taxes they pay. And so you can imagine this issue is not really new to government. Unfortunately, what we haven't always been so good at is using our data effectively. And so what we've seen in the past is states have traditionally built systems in silos. They do a very good job operationally at meeting our business needs. But when we start to have decisions that need to be based on data that crosses our agency lines of business, we aren't so good at sharing. Probably all of you have been in some sort of situation where someone has said, I need to be able to understand this particular issue. And when you begin to look at where you get data to answer that question, you realize it's going to take a considerable amount of time to bring that data from multiple locations together, to get it into a common and consistent format, and then to make it usable. And if you have to do that over and over again, sometimes it's just a very time-consuming, tedious process. And so what we're seeing in government is a real drive to make our data assets more usable, to help us understand which data assets are most relevant, and to kind of move this idea of analytics out of the back office, where there's only certain people who know how to access and use this data, into the hands of people who are making decisions. And so what we're trying to do is really move from the idea of data to pulling it together and making it information, and then putting it in the hands of the right people so it becomes knowledge, so that we can make operational decisions better, tactical decisions, strategic decisions, policy decisions, based on information, based on data, based on fact, rather than, I think this is what we should do today. And what's driving government to do this? Well, it's a variety of things, and I'm sure none of this list is new to any of you. There's a huge push for transparency and accountability in government. Where are we spending our money, and how is it achieving the kinds of outcomes we want? Effectiveness and efficiency. Are we doing the best job the smartest way we know how? Reducing fraud and crime, making sure people are complying with our rules and regulations, improving public safety and well-being, both in the area of criminal justice, but also in children who are in our protective care, and the issues of things like human trafficking that we've heard about earlier today. Improving the citizen experience. I mean, how many of you love to go onto the internet and order a pair of shoes and have it at your house the next day? That's what it's like when you deal with the government on the internet, right? Not really, but what we can do is start to change that citizen experience by making data more readily available. And then finally, letting those policy decisions being made by state government be driven by data, rather sort of than, again, that intuition and supposition. So again, what do we talk about when we talk about really making data meaningful and being able to use it? And what we talk about a lot is beginning to understand that data really exceeds the boundaries of our own agencies. As we begin to look at our business issues and the things that we need to change in government, those complex problems that we're faced with every day, we've got to begin to look at our data and how we evaluate it and use it in a different way. We need to look at fostering collaboration across our agencies and understand that by bringing data from different sources that we aren't usually having access to, we can change our understanding of a situation. So imagine that I'm dealing with a youth in a juvenile justice situation. If I can understand the social service programs that his family has been involved in, whether there are mental health issues or addictions, if I understand how he did in school, did he have the kinds of programs that he's needed? Is there family members who have criminal justice background? All those things can help me better understand the needs of that youth and make the best decisions to change outcomes for that child. By looking only at what I know from him from his youth case file, I might be limited and might not make the best decision. We also believe there's issues associated with data quality and data standards, and so coming up with a common, consistent approach to how we're going to use our data and how we're going to bring it to common formats that make it more accessible is also important. Technologies and tool sets. I talked about getting this data out of the back office and into the hands of our business users. And what we're really seeing is a change in technologies, an ability to bring data to easier visualization tools, things that the end user can actually have access to that information and begin to understand and gain insights from the data. And then again, building competencies, helping people understand what the idea of analytics is and how we can use data to help us prioritize our business and make better decisions. So it sounds logical, it sounds straightforward. What's the big challenge with it? Well, any of you guys who've worked in data or have in analytics in your career knows that there's all sorts of issues. What is the first question or what's the first answer you get if somebody says, "Can you share some data with me?" First answer is always no. No, can't share it, never have, never will, it's a criminal fine, can't do it. So data governance is really an issue that is faced in a lot of situations where we want to begin to look at analytics on a broader perspective. The kinds of agencies we work with and the data that they collect can be very, very different. And so we've got to understand who we're talking about working with and what they can share with us. Security and auditing. How do we protect this data and control who's using it and prove how it's being used? Certainly nobody wants to risk breaches of privacy or security. And then you've got the integration issues. Nobody's data is alike. It's all on different technology platforms. Heck, in some agencies, it might still be on paper. In other agencies, it's in Excel spreadsheets. And then in other agencies, we've got hierarchical and relational databases. It's in all kinds of standards. It's hard to tell who the same person is from one agency to another. So a lot of these issues become key challenges when we start to talk about really using our data in a new way. So what I'm going to do today is talk to you a little bit about my experience in North Carolina and share with you just a little bit of how we addressed some of these issues to achieve a new way of using our data with the Government Data Analytics Center in the state. So back in about 2007, North Carolina made a decision that they wanted to use their data assets a little bit more strategically. We had legislators who were kind of tired of asking questions and always getting the answer that we couldn't really find that answer for them for about 6 months. And by the time we got that answer to them, it would be out of date, and it would take us another 6 months to get an updated version of it. So they asked us to really look at this idea of a statewide data integration initiative. How would you break down the barriers for data sharing? And we came up with a strategic plan. And everybody loves strategic plan in government, don't you? They're all great and theoretical, not so necessarily easy to implement. And so we talked about we're going to build communities of interest, people who are interested in similar kinds of data. We're going to talk about starting small and growing from there. And we're going to build common technologies and tool sets so that we become smart about how we use data and do analytics. The interesting thing was, as we went out and began to talk with agencies, nobody really wanted to work with us. So it was a bit of a challenge. So one of our first lessons we learned was, know a key business need. What is a question that needs to be answered? Because that's the way to gain buy-in and to get people involved. Unfortunately for us in North Carolina, that key business need came from a tragedy. You may be familiar with North Carolina. I don't know, it's a long way away. It's a much smaller state than California. But do any of y'all know Duke University or the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill? So our two most prestigious universities. Over the course of just a few weeks, a Duke graduate student was murdered in his home. And a few weeks later, the student body president at the University of North Carolina was kidnapped from her home, driven around campus to get money out of the ATM, and then murdered on the street right in front of her house. What came to light in those investigations was that the same men killed both students. Not only that, it came to light that both men had warrants for their arrest out. In the weeks just prior to the murders, one of them had been stopped by a law enforcement officer who had overlooked the warrant and let the gentleman go free. I'm not sure I should call him a gentleman. The other person was in our court system. He came to court one day to answer to a probation violation that could have put him in prison. His papers went to one courtroom. He was sent to a different courtroom. The judge continued the case, and the student body president was murdered 3 days later. So you can imagine the publicity and the focus in our state. How could we have let these students down? How did we overlook key information? This is our criminal justice system. Don't they all talk to each other? And we see CSI on TV where, you know, somebody breathes on a window and we can figure out who they are because we've got all this information. That's not what was going on in the real world in North Carolina. So we suddenly had a group of agencies who was focused on solving the problem, bringing data together across our courts, our corrections, our 96 jails, our sex offender registry, our DMV, even our wildlife hunting and fishing licenses of all things, which gave us a really good address for people. Because I might lie about my address if you're trying to arrest me, but if I want to go fishing, I'm going to give you the right address. And what we began to do was bring this data together. Again, the challenges. The data was in different formats in all of those different systems. And people were identified very differently across all those systems. So many, many challenges were faced in beginning to pull up a comprehensive profile of an offender together. But by bringing those parties together, by setting a governance structure, we were able to completely identify a person across all those data sets, build a comprehensive profile of an offender that allowed now a single system for law enforcement to use that would show all this information, and allow a watch list capability. So CJ Leeds now serves about 27,000 criminal justice professionals. That's courts, corrections, probation and parole, law enforcement agencies from the state, federal, and local level. And now they can search in a single application and see all the information about a person, highlighted in red when there's something I want you to pay attention to. If you notice at the very top of the screen, red icons that we can assess and analyze the data and now warn you that this person is dangerous and has an AWC, approach with caution. Perhaps they're on the sex offender registry, or perhaps they're a member of a gang. Suddenly, it's all in one place, easy to see, and it changes the way law enforcement, courts, and corrections interacts with the offender. And because we have all of this information gathered together, and we know where it is in all these subsequent source systems, we can do things like create a watch list. So now if I have a person of interest, or I'm a probation officer and I'm supervising 100 people, 100 people are on my watch list, anything that changes about them in any of those 100+ systems, I get an alert and I now can take action. So I have a probationer who's arrested, I'm able to go and figure out what's going on with him. Do I need to move into a different facility? You know, how do I take action much more proactively? And it gives us the ability to begin to understand our population as a whole. How are we dealing with these individuals? What types of encounters do we have with them? And begin to make things like policy and sentencing decisions. We begin to understand issues like recidivism much better. How do I make a decision at pretrial sentencing, what I'm going to do with this person until their trial date? A huge analytic repository that really changes the way North Carolina is looking at their criminal justice organizations. So CJ Leeds was our first project, our first venture, and what it really taught us was the idea of how did we do data sharing agreements? How did we bring the right people to the table and gain access to data sets we maybe hadn't had access to before. Over time, CJ Leads continued to grow, even though it started out with a few small data sets. And we started out with the most obvious, corrections and court systems. We added in DMV, which amazingly was difficult to do because it's protected very tightly by federal law. Over time, we got mental health information, so we began to work closely between mental health and law enforcement. We began to get domestic violence protective orders, and CJ Leads has grown over the last 5 or 6 years to now have a wide variety of data that now allows for many, many operational purposes, but for a wide range of analytics. It sort of set the foundation for us. We now sort of knew what it took to share data, to control it, to be able to audit it and ensure that it was being used for the appropriate purposes. And so what happens in state government when something works? You get more work to do. So what North Carolina asked us to do was to begin to take that same concept and think about whether or not we could look at an idea of something like enterprise fraud. If we could bring all the data together about an offender, could we do it on people who were being paid by government, people who were receiving benefits, the providers that were involved in many of our programs? And so we began to branch out now into some other areas. What we found here was we did the same kind of concept in terms of bringing information together about businesses, about people who were receiving payments from our unemployment and our workers' comp insurance programs. So unemployment, we were bringing together not only information about wage and tax filings, but the people who were receiving benefits. We brought in our state HR payroll system. We brought in our Secretary of State corporate registrations. The DMV data that we had already gathered for CJ Leads was valuable. Heck, that criminal justice data was valuable because now we were looking for anybody who was receiving an unemployment benefit who was in prison or in jail. Well, we'd always checked prison, but now suddenly we had 96 jails worth of data to check. And we began to understand that we not only could use the UI data that people had been using for fraud, but we could expand that picture by looking at all this other data that had been collected for CJ Leads and now had been brought in for UI fraud detection. So the kinds of things we found, employers who would file and say they have no employees, but DMV shows that they have 20 plus corporate vehicles. I don't know, who's driving your cars? We began to be able to find things like fictitious businesses, a business who registers with our Secretary of State and then files unemployment insurance wage reports back for 6 quarters. Before they've ever paid their tax bill, all of a sudden they lay off all 30 employees, and all those 30 employees began to draw benefits within 2 or 3 days of them filing 6 quarters worth of wages. It was a pattern. It was a pattern they knew about, but they couldn't detect without having it in data. And we were suddenly able to now say, gosh, isn't it interesting that those 30 employees don't have a driver's license in the state of North Carolina? And in fact, they don't live in North Carolina. Their addresses are all in Ohio. And the address of the company is a Motel 8, and so on and so forth. You could begin to really change that perception. We moved on to workers' comp insurance, and North Carolina has now moved into tax fraud, retirement plan fraud, where we're looking at things like people returning to work and earning money or pay spiking right before they go into retirement. So you can imagine that what we really found was a new way to use data. What we didn't want to do, though, was recreate those same silos in our analytics systems that we saw in our transaction systems. So one of the key factors of GDAC was writing data sharing agreements that would allow us to bring the data in and use it for multiple purposes. It took a huge amount of coordination and effort, but the results that are achieved are significant. So when we talk about fraud analysis, what kinds of things are we doing? How are we suddenly able to see things that we couldn't see before? Well, when we talk about our fraud analytics, there's a variety of things that we do with this data. We obviously take the approach that most people are taking with their systems, and that's business rules. If you are receiving unemployment benefits, you should not be getting a paycheck from someone else. I'm going to flag you if you are. But we can also do things like anomaly detection. I can put you into peer groups with data and begin to understand this is what normal looks like, who's falling way outside the norm. And so there we can see things like a business that suddenly begins to lose a significant number of employees while a very similarly related business is gaining a number of employees. That's called pseudo-dumping, dropping your employees from one company and bringing them into a new one that has a lower tax rate. So that's anomaly detection. We have the ability to do things like text mining, where we can search case notes and look for information in phrases and find sentiment analysis. Social network analysis. Can we begin to show you that these businesses are related by addresses, by business owners, by telephones, by the number of employees that are, or the common employees between them? And suddenly, through social network analysis, I can show you rings of people who are related. This is particularly important in things like prescription drug monitoring, where we're now trying to understand who's doing doctor shopping. Do we have pharmacies and doctors who are colluding together to divert prescription drugs onto the black market? And then predictive models. Now that I know what fraud looks like, how do I begin to look forward? How do I change that perspective and begin to understand that if I see these patterns, I need to flag somebody, I need to pay attention to this and to begin to understand that it is reflecting the same behavior that we've already identified as fraud. And so what we found is that we can use data in so many different ways. Just to give you a few ideas of things we're seeing going on in states, healthcare analytics, beginning to understand broader than just the medical data, understanding social service, mental health, addiction information. We can do claims analytics, population health, fraud detection in Medicaid. We're even seeing epidemiology, using analytics for key outbreaks. It's interesting, Mr. Zilka, we were just talking about the Zika virus. But the analysis of understanding how that's spreading and how you stop an incident like that most effectively. Fraud, waste, and abuse detection, case prioritization. It's not necessarily always about finding more fraud, but making sure that we're focusing our resources on the best cases of fraud to go after. So if I have a group of workers who can focus on 500 cases a week, do I want them to just be the cases that came off the top of the stack? Or do I use analytics to really understand what makes up that fraud case and prioritize them so that my resources are focused on those that represent the greatest exposure for my government? Predictive risk scoring and alerting, and we're going to talk a little bit about child safety to give you a demo and show you what child safety looks like when you can use lots of data and use predictive scoring and alerting. Juvenile justice reform, I talked about that a few minutes ago. And we're really hearing a huge push now to better understand the youths who are in our juvenile justice system. Even in our adult prison population. A few years back, we went through truth in sentencing and the 3 strikes law, where we're going to throw people into prison. If they have 3 strikes, they're in for life. And what we're really finding is what we've done is overpopulated our prison with a lot of nonviolent offenders. The result of that is families have lost their primary source of income. Now those families are in social services. The cost, socially and economically, to our government is huge. So how do we better understand those factors and understand who should be back into society, supervised, with appropriate controls, but don't necessarily need to be in prison? That's not necessarily achieving the outcomes we want. Real-time analysis, program outcomes, cybersecurity analytics, understanding who's getting into our networks and how they're moving through our networks and potentially causing our data to be at risk. There's endless possibilities about how we can better use our data to transform the way we're doing government business. So I'm really excited now for you guys to see our child safety demo. And Joe's going to talk a little bit about the kinds of data we bring into it and the way that we use it to help caseworkers do a better job protecting our most vulnerable children.
All right, thanks, Kay. You good? All right, there we go. Good, sure. Okay, as Kay mentioned before, my name is Joe Zilka, and I'm a Government Solutions Manager with SAS. I've been with SAS about 15 and a half years, exclusively in the government space, with experience in detecting and preventing fraud, waste, and abuse, government health care, social services, child safety, transportation, and a few other areas. Great overview, Kay, about how a holistic view of an individual or of an entity can be of value. I'm going to talk a little bit here about how we apply some of the advanced analytics to operationalize the analytics the advanced analytics to impact decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to switch over to the demo here. And again, I've been at SAS about 15 and a half years. I'm from Ohio, and I understand that you all think it's cold today. Is that right? I just want to make that clear. So, again, here's an example, again, of operationalizing analytics. There's a lot of backroom use of analytics. Some people think it's a very complex technology, and it is. There's a lot of science involved in it. We've got a staff of about 400 or so data scientists at SAS that help create some algorithms and do some predictive modeling that folks use. This is an example of what we might deploy to a caseworker or a set of supervisors in the child safety space that leverage those analytics. The names and everything here has been modified. This is fabricated data, so please don't think this is real data. I'd be in trouble if it were. So here's an interface that we might deploy. A caseworker comes in the morning and needs to understand what child in my caseload is most at risk today. Well, how do we figure that out, right? So here I've got a case number, I've got a child's name, the address, the number of previous visits, as well as a risk score. And the risk scores and what we're shown here can be applied to many different problem statements. Here we're talking about child safety. It could be risk of maltreatment, abuse, neglect. It could be recidivism for juvenile justice. It could be recidivism for adult offenders. Right? So the problem statement we model, this can be used against several different areas. Here we're talking specifically about child safety, about abuse and neglect. Here I've got a few different other things that show me the risk level for Samantha Conway is very high. Risk over time, so I can understand what the trend is, and we'll talk about the value of applying analytics over time and rescoring or reassessing some of these individuals over time. So again, here I can log in and look very quickly at my caseload and who might be highest at risk. There's some filtering capability, obviously some feature functionality that's meant to try to drive the efficiencies around understanding the caseload as well as reducing the workload associated with those cases. Getting that holistic view again, not just for being able to run analytics on those different attributes, but also seeing that information in order to make decisions. I also want to point out that this risk scoring is not meant to replace any decision-making process that a caseworker might do. Right? This is not replacing human decision-making. This is meant to be used as additional information to make informed decisions with respect to individual children. So here I'm going to look at Samantha Conway. I'm going to click in and go to the details screen, and I'm running this over a hotspot to a server back in Raleigh. Okay, so what we see here again, on the second screen, it's really three screens. Ease of use here, operationalizing analytics and being able to make impactful decisions. On the left-hand side, we've really got all of the information we kind of saw on the previous screen, Samantha Conway, her address, previous visits, etc. Over here on the upper right-hand side is what we've got is, let's call it a risk scorecard. I don't like using the term scorecard when we're talking about children and applying a number per se, but what it's really doing is showing us why this particular child scored so highly in this situation. And I'm going to expand this to show all the different attributes. And here's an example of a model that we might use and deploy in the child safety space. It's important to note that anytime you're applying predictive modeling, anomaly detection algorithms, rules, social network analysis, you really want to do this for each individual organization's data. It's important not to bring in models developed in New York City to California, from New York to California, from California to Florida. They're all a little bit different, although many of the concepts and what we collect are the same. Analytics really need to be evolved and developed on each organization's data. So again, what we see here is just something we might choose for a deployment at a particular customer site. So here I've got a total score of 23. We've split this up into two problem statements, the neglect score as well as the abuse score. And here I see the different components that make up that particular score. There was a previous neglect complaint, a previous investigation, prior CPS visits. I can show the score or the contribution, the weight of that particular risk component, as well as any other information that might be relevant. So we see information here. Some of these factors may be relatively static, right? So low birth weight, no father's name on the birth certificate, age of the mother at birth, those things aren't going to change. But what does change is information that we may collect from other organizations or from within our agency. Again, how many investigations were there? Is the mother receiving mental health treatment? Is she in substance abuse? Those types of dynamic factors are very hard to detect for a caseworker if they're not out trying to gather that information and understand the impact. So we continuously monitor the data sources that we have access to, the more the better. But here, analytics is going to help us understand the static factors, the dynamic factors, as well as the interactions between the factors. So if we've got 10 risk factors and the child or family exhibits behaviors in 5 of those categories, the risk factor might not be 5, it may be 50, it may be 500, right? So different combinations of risk factors may introduce actual levels of risk, or differences in actual levels of risk. And that's what analytics helps us do, right? It's very hard to look at a spreadsheet of information and try to just guess and look at that information and make those decisions and understand what is the most highly significant factors. Analytics allows us to do that. And I think it's important here is that we start to understand what those factors are, and the caseworker can see that information and say, hey, there were some previous visits. Here I've got a recent domestic violence report in the household. That's very relevant. Analytics has told us so, although anecdotally I think that makes sense as well. But here we're able to present that information to people so they can understand what the model is doing and take action based on what they see. As I mentioned, one of the things, as we collect all this information and create this holistic view and run our analytics on it, to kind of reduce the workload associated with the case is we can present some of that information on tabs at the bottom, right? So here I've got some of my recent interventions, I have previous referrals, perhaps I've got some recent domestic violence incidents. If I have education data, I might see disciplinary information, I might see grade trending, right? Things that a caseworker might use to say, hey, we see the risk score, we see attendance is down and grades have been dropping, they've changed schools, changes of addresses with respect to the family, might all be relevant factors in presenting that information to the caseworker to make those decisions. So again, as we collect all this information and run our analytics, important to give the users that information in order to understand why they're scored so highly, as well as prevent them from logging into 3 or 4 different systems to track down that information and make some real decisions. Last chart I want to show here is just the risk trend. I talked about before is that we kind of do this in a continuously monitoring fashion, and it's important to run these analytics. Again, any problem statement we're looking at, whether it's fraud, waste, or abuse, whether it's recidivism, whether it's child safety, rerunning these over time allows us to get a better picture with respect to the risk in this associated entity. So here I've got 2 different scores. I had a score for abuse and a score for neglect, and here I've plotted those over time. I've got increases and decreases. Perhaps this is where the child moves back in with a relative. We might have a domestic violence report in the home at this particular point in time. But again, the point here is that it is looking at this, continuously monitoring it over time. In the child's safety space, if a caseworker is not going out, visiting a house, asking questions, collecting information, and not able to troll all the different sources of information because they don't honestly have the time to do that, it may be difficult to understand changes in their environment which may introduce risk or reduce risk in a particular case. So again, automated processing, that holistic view, and applying those analytics is very crucial. The last screen I want to show here is social network analysis. And I think Kay touched on this a little bit. It's not Facebook and Twitter. We do that too, but this is a little different. It's pretty cool. Using the data to understand the relationships between the different entities that we're concerned with. So here in this particular diagram, this is generated automatically for this particular case. In the middle, I've got Samantha Conway as the case. She lives at this address at 8511 South Main Street. The mother, Paula Conway, sister Paula Conway, part of her family. So here what I can do is, again, I'm going to use a time slider at the bottom, and I'm going to click back a few times. And what we've got here is we can start to visualize and understand the impact of the relationships Samantha has with other individuals within this particular diagram. It's important to note that these relationships can also be incorporated into that risk scoring. So if I'm related or I have a relationship with a risky individual, recent domestic violence arrest, that would be very important to know. So again, here I see Samantha Conway living at her address. I stepped through time and I realized that she had been placed into foster care with Philip Ford. There's another adult as well as 2 children involved there. Another click shows me where she moved in with the aunt, Heidi Arnett in Pasadena. And then lastly, Samantha moves back in with her mother at 8511 South Main Street. And there are a few other individuals living in the home, namely John Porter and another unrelated child, Jesse Porter. We see the icons have changed colors here, so we kind of use these to help take that risk score associated with the different entities, whether it's Samantha Conway, whether it's a house, and provide some visual cues to the caseworkers to say, hey, we know Samantha Conway's at risk, but this house is at risk, right? And we use, again, using colors to provide those cues. We see here, again, we've got this unrelated adult, John Porter, that lives in the home. And we're going to expand this out and try to understand exactly why John Porter provided some risk for this particular address. We realize he's a cohabitant of the mother, Paula Conway. And drilling in and looking at some of the details associated with John Porter, we see we've got some offender summary data on John Julian Porter. And if we click on that, in this case, we've got access to a system similar to CJ Leeds. You see the screen looks very familiar, right? We can see all the information related to John Julian Porter. We've got a picture, we've got outstanding processes, court records, jail stays, sex offender registry information. There's even a domestic violence tab here that we might be able to show and say, hey, you know, this is where the arrest came from. So now we know a lot more about John Julian Porter, and the fact that he'd been arrested for domestic violence and lives at that particular address introduces risk into Samantha Conway's life. So again, another you know, widget that we like to use when we're starting to understand the risk associated with the individuals. Here's the timeline that we saw with respect to John Porter when he was arrested, the court, the processes, the jail time, etc. Similar graphs are created for the child and the services they've received, right? So if there were interventions, if the child's receiving a particular social service, if the family's receiving a social service, all that information could get displayed in order to understand exactly what's going on with this family. So I think in this case around child safety, or we're talking about recidivism, or we're talking about law enforcement cases, you know, the next step in the process is what's the next best thing I can do for this individual, right? And honestly, I don't know a lot of government organizations that have gotten to that point yet, at least not operationalizing it. We certainly look to say, here are all the instances, we understand who's at risk, now what's the best thing that we could provide for this individual that's the best for them, the most economical for the state, right? Those types of questions we like to answer. So again, I think that the next step is being prescriptive with these services. This demonstration here was meant to kind of show you an example of what could happen in the child safety space. It does the same thing with risk scoring around fraud, waste, or abuse, or recidivism for juvenile justice. But I think certainly the next step in the process, and most organizations are headed, is now we know who's at risk, let's find out what the best course of actions are for these particular individuals. So I think that takes me up. We left a little bit of time here for questions. That's what we wanted to do. That takes care of our demonstration. I hope you get a feel for what operationalizing of analytics looks like. Again, I don't know a lot of government organizations that are really bringing this to the front office. And here's certainly an example of how we can impact day-to-day decisions with respect to analytics. So we'll take a few questions here if there are any. What would it take to get government entities to actually collaborate? And I'll maybe defer to Kay on that one.
A lot of persistence and banging your head against the wall. No. You know what, we've seen it work differently in different states across the nation. In North Carolina, we had a legislative initiative that sort of outlined who would participate and what they were obligated to do, and actually gave us a bit of a stick in terms of saying, in any agency that will not participate, please report back to the legislature and tell us, and we're going to figure out what it needs to be. In other states, we've seen governor executive orders, you know, but a lot of times it's been federal mandates or just a key compelling issue. Our focus on unemployment insurance fraud in North Carolina came to pass because it was during the economic downturn, and we were about $2 billion in debt to the federal government for our UI trust fund. And so we had agencies looking for an answer. They wanted somebody to come in and help them. So sometimes I think it could be many different things. A few things that become important is good, strong legal counsel who can really understand data sharing regulations, because you've got to get past this idea of never have shared my data and I can't. You've also got to be able to show those agencies what is in it for them. If I'm asking you to give me data, I want to show you what you're going to get out of it. So a lot of times sometimes it's getting to a quick analytic solution so I can show some value back. And we do talk about a process that we use at SAS of doing early exploratory data analysis and getting results back very quickly to customers so that they can see what this is going to do in the long term, and then it takes a little longer to sort of do the operationalization of that.
And I think that's where a lot of organizations struggle, depending on the organization, the amount of analytical talent within the organization. So the first part is the data sharing part, right? But again, there are varying levels of maturity. And that usually takes some compelling event, like we saw in North Carolina, some visionary within an organization that can champion an often stigmatized effort to get this type of sharing accomplished.
Yeah, I will say though, I believe that at both the federal and state levels, we're starting to see that culture change a little bit. You know, certainly after 9/11 happened, you saw it at the federal level where, you know, the FBI and the CIA and all those weren't really working together. And Homeland Security, in 15 years, still hasn't necessarily achieved everything they hoped to, but we are making steps in the right direction. And I think it's a lot about understanding what those inhibitors are. Are they turf, cultural, or are they truly law? There was a CIO from the state of Michigan, and he said one time, and I loved his quote, he said, you know, you got to look at the law and understand it, and understand really whether you can't share the data, or you can, but with these parameters. Or if that law doesn't make sense, you need to go try to get the law changed.
I think it's rarely a technology problem. I know you mentioned disparate databases and data quality issues, but the technology is not a problem these days. There's ways to get data from one organization to another.
Well, and you know, when you talk about things like background checks for gun purchases and that kind of thing, I mean, this sort of data sharing is absolutely crucial to be sure that you are getting the right checks, you know, done on people as they are looking at things like that. And there will always be the opposite argument of Big Brother, of civil liberties. We advocate, at least in the program that I worked with in the state of North Carolina, we really advocated that while we were bringing this data together for government purposes, we took huge security precautions in terms of trying to protect it and ensure that only the right people could access it. So even in that law enforcement solution, there were pieces of data in that law enforcement solution that not everybody could see. So a warrant for someone's arrest it's not information that everybody that was a user of that system could see. So, you know, using role-based security to protect certain pieces of information was key. But the child safety solution, you know, it's one of those things somebody will say, you can't share education data that's FERPA protected. You know, you can't share mental health data. But when a state has become the custodian of that child as part of Child Protective Services, you actually have the right to have access to all that data because it's your job to protect that child. So again, so many factors you have to understand, but I think you're right. Data sharing is one of the key issues to address first. Other questions?
There's one back there.
We've been speaking a lot to states and, you know, interdepartmental sharing.
Mm-hmm.
But in North Carolina, it looks like they've got that good structure in place already for their state itself. Has any momentum been gained on the state sharing data with the federal level?
So with CJ Leads, we are working right now on actually doing federal access to like inlets and index, which if you know criminal justice, that's the national criminal justice systems. The U.S. Department of Labor is very interested in what they're doing in the UI fraud space. But what we've seen more is an interest in going the opposite direction, and that's actually sharing with counties and municipalities. So child safety is a good example. In North Carolina, they're starting on child safety, but they're starting actually with a county because our Child Protective Services is county administered. And so they're starting with sharing data sort of towards the county. So we're seeing it more going that way, at least from my experience, than towards the federal government.
And I think there are some states, departments of revenue that are using federal tax return data in conjunction with their state data in order to try to find some of those underfilers, tax evaders. That's pretty common as well.
Were there other
Was there
questions?
I think about one more question. We only got about 3 minutes left. Was there another one back there?
How scalable is the product that you're using for this example? Like, could it be used within one agency to look at databases, or is it more for gigantic users like you're describing?
So it is very scalable. So the exact same framework, it's a risk scoring framework is what I call it. Here our problem statement was child safety. There are Medicaid agencies that use this. From the enterprise approach, we've got a series of alerts that get deployed to Medicaid for provider fraud for individuals. We use the same framework in states for departments of revenue, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, food stamps. So it's the same framework, just a different content area, and those things can all be stacked up using that same technology platform. They'll share data, and they'll typically view their alerts on their entities within their own department. And they might share the fact that they're doing an investigation on this individual in another department. They don't necessarily want to share the details of that with those. So again, it's based on the state and what they want to share with respect to who they're investigating. A lot of times they don't want other entities to know if they're even investigating somebody.
But we've seen it used in groups that the investigative unit is as small as 6 or 8 people. So, obviously, it's really more about making the best use of those resources. And so we see it in kind of all size organizations.
I think in another implementation, they've taken it and deployed an individual work queue for each managed care organization within the state. So, you're talking about, 4 or 5 different MCOs, all receiving their own sets of alerts, same exact implementation, versus a 6 or 7 or 8 size department. So,
Well, we will be here to answer other questions if anybody has a question we didn't get to, but thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it.
thank you.